So today marks the 10th anniversary of the war on Syria. Some people call it an uprising, a revolution against a dictatorship. Others say it was an internal turmoil and then turned into a civil war or a proxy war, etc., etc. In my humble opinion, I believe from the first day, there was an attempt to hijack the legitimate demands of the people, including myself, that I called for reform in the political system and reform in the economic system. However, it was also very clear to me from day one, because I follow most if not all opposition pages, activists, especially the ones that the mainstream media, they don't shed light on them because they don't want to show that there is a big portion of the people who are calling for protests against the government are the Islamists. And I documented this in length and in details on Syriana analysis. If you're interested in these videos, I will put some links in the description below. Please go and watch them. I addressed the early days of the so-called Syrian revolution. So, in my opinion, of course, there were protests. Tens of thousands were calling for reforms in Syria, and these demands were hijacked by regional and international powers. And they worked consistently to radicalize the Syrian people, to mobilize the people and urge them to use violence and to carry arms and resort to terroristic techniques. And when their policies didn't succeed entirely, they started to mobilize the multinational jihadists, and the first multinational jihadi group established in Syria was in late 2011, and it was a group called Al-Muhajirin. Muhajirin means the migrants, and they fought alongside the so-called Free Syrian Army. So I'm not going further into details of the first days of the revolution. You can check the videos as I mentioned in the description below. However, today I'm going to talk about the lessons that we as Syrians should learn from this war, and at the same time what other smaller countries similar to Syria or countries who oppose or disagree with the American hegemony, and what should they do in this regard, because most of these countries will be, in my opinion, in one way or shape or form targeted by the United States, whether directly or indirectly. The first lesson that we need to learn: countries like Syria need strategic allies. And when I say strategic allies, I particularly want to mention Russia and Iran in this regard. When the war started in 2011, the intensity of the war was not that great, but in 2012, 13, 14, especially with the introduction of the Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front in the Syrian battlefield, and later ISIS, it was very difficult for the Syrian army to continue on all the fronts and to withstand against all these tens of thousands of multinational jihadists coming from all over the world, passing through Turkey into Syria, and they are committing horrendous crimes against the Syrian people and against the Syrian army. So during this period, over 100 countries formed what is called the Friends of Syria Committee. Of course, in my opinion, they are the enemies of the Syrian people. And they started to give arms, ammunition, all kinds of support to radical jihadists in Syria. And recently, for example, the role of the Netherlands, for example, was exposed of how the Netherlands supplied aid to jihadists in Syria, that the Netherlands itself considers them terrorist organization. Now, in 2012, Iran intervened in Syria. Also, the Yellow Flag Party of Lebanon, I'm not going to mention the name because YouTube will delete it, also intervened. Iran was mostly sent military advisors, and the Yellow Flag Party from Lebanon sent thousands, if not tens of thousands of fighters. The numbers are estimated between 5 to 20,000 fighters. And it was important in this particular time to have a strategic allies to fight. Like, fighting is important in such battle, especially when it is fourth generation of asymmetrical warfare and guerrilla warfare techniques, whereas the Syrian army was used to fight regular warfares, not guerrilla warfares. So you needed a group like the Yellow Flag Party in Lebanon that masters the guerrilla warfare in order to give support to you. But even with the intervention of Iran and the Yellow Flag Party, it was still the flow of the weaponry and the training and the money that is coming to Syria and the multinational jihadists. It was still impossible to regain the vast majority of the territories. So between 2014 and 2015, Syria and even Iran negotiated with Russia, with President Vladimir Putin, for him to intervene in Syria and add considerable support to the Syrian army and the boots on the ground that are fighting against these terrorists. So the intervention of Russia was very crucial here, especially with the aerial superiority of the Russian armed forces, and it was a game-changing, let's say. So the first thing that smaller countries like Syria, or countries that are vulnerable to an American regime change wars or coup d'etats or any kind of war that the United States is launching against them, you need strategic allies that are ready to fight, the actual fight on the ground with you. Unlike other so-called allies of Syria, such as Turkey and Qatar. You know, Turkey and Qatar had very good relations with Syria before the war, especially between 2005 and 2010. And the relationships were not only on a political and economic level, but also on a family level. Assad used to go for tourism in Turkey with Erdogan, and Hamad bin Jassim, the former emir of Qatar, and his wife were like on a regular basis, and maybe sometimes weekly basis in Syria. People were used to see these figures in the streets in Syria. They even bought castles in many places, in many cities in Syria. So in my opinion, this was one of the grave mistakes of Syria. At one hand, it had a good foreign policy by having a strategic partnership with Iran and Russia, but at the same time, this alliance with Turkey and Qatar Syrians have paid a huge price for opening their country into these two countries who mainly are ruled by ideologues, and they are exporting their ideology, the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, and they have an expansionist tendencies, especially Erdogan. The second lesson that we learned from the Syrian war, that I think we should have learned this much before, but this just came to assure that this is true. Radical Islamists, and especially the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, ISIS, are in one way or another NATO's and the United States boots on the ground. It is not a coincidence that in the early 20s, the Brits, they founded and supported the Muslim Brotherhood organization in Egypt in order to hit and destroy and weaken the nationalist movements, Arab nationalist movements, pan-Arabist movements, socialist movements in the area. So they created a rivalry for the nationalist powers who were calling for independence from foreign occupations, and they made them busy in this internal fight between the Islamists and the nationalists. It is not a coincidence that Britain supported them in the 19th century or in the 20th century. It is not a coincidence that the United States supported the same jihadists in Afghanistan, starting from the 80s. It is no coincidence that they used them in Chechnya. It is no coincidence that NATO used them in Libya. It is no coincidence that the strategic ally of the United States, Saudi Arabia, has exported this ideology, the radical ideology of Wahhabism, in the last decades. Now, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, he is vowing to stop this destructive policy of exporting Wahhabism. I hope he would stop it. And he did in 2018. He stopped the support of the Islam's army in Syria, or Jaish al-Islam, and the party has been defeated by the Syrian army. The third lesson is media outlets lie, period. You cannot convince me that when I'm in, for example, Syria, in a place, and I see things with my own eyes, and then when I open one of the mainstream media outlets, I read or I watch or I listen the opposite of what I saw with my own eyes. And the media lies were very, very, very destructive. In the Syrian case, they created or promoted for certain narratives. For example, the Syrian army is committing massacres here in this town and that town, and there is ethnic cleansing actually happening according to the mainstream media in certain towns and cities. If you remember what happened in Aleppo, that the Syrian army is ethnically cleansing the people, and the people started to commit suicide and throw themselves from the roof of the buildings, which was an utter complete lie. But this lies has provoked certain people in Syria, and they believed it, and they started to take revenge because of these lies. So they started to carry arms because of what they heard in the media, especially the Arabic media, especially Al Jazeera, that the Syrian army is committing these crimes. So it was logical for them to carry arms and fight from their own perspective. The second thing is, for example, hosting radical imams, clerics, etc. Especially Al Jazeera, they host this Sheikh Youssef al-Qaradawi, one of the highest scholars in the Islamic world. And he is also a Muslim Brotherhood ideologue, and he was openly calling and giving fatwas of killing not only the Syrian army soldiers but also civilians who work in government institutions. Like if you work in the Ministry of Education, if you work in the Ministry of Energy, for example, or any other ministries, it was halal to kill these people according to these radical sheikhs and radical imams, and they were 24 hours having 24/7 having an open access for and the platforms on these media outlets to utter their disgusting genocidal fatwas and other teachings. For example, the media lied about the chemical attacks in Syria, and recently in Duma, and the scandal of the Duma, which was exposed later by the investigators in the OPCW and the whistleblowers who, without a shred of doubt, proved that the management of the OPCW suppressed the final report of the investigators and changed it in order to give a pretext to the United States, Britain, and France to bomb Syria. So it's not only the media outlets who lied, but also international organizations such as the OPCW, such as the Human Rights Watch. This Kenneth Roth, I think the executive director of the Human Rights. You wonder sometimes if this guy is a director of a credible organization, or he's a troll, or he's a he's a political activist. It's confusing. If you follow, for example, his tweet, you need to ask this question: if this guy, how can you trust this guy if he is so biased on the side of the rebels in Syria or the militants against Assad? The Amnesty International lied in Libya, for example, and said that Gaddafi is using black mercenaries to kill the protesters, and it was too late later to apologize for their mistake. And they did the same thing in Syria. I believe in 2017 or 18, they published an article or a reportage investigation that between 5,000 to 13,000 people died in Saidnaya prison. Look, I'm not saying that the conditions there are like in Switzerland, but when you when you want to make such a big claim that between 5 and 13,000 people died, you need to document that. And in order to document that, you cannot build your entire investigation on unknown activists and unknown sources. Someone is sitting in Turkey and telling you what happened in Syria. And this is what the Amnesty International did. But all these media lies and the lies from the organizations gave legitimacy, political legitimacy, and a cover for the militants, for the terrorists in Syria in order to continue their fight against the Syrian government. One of the lessons that we Syrians also need to learn is how to manage our economy. For example, before 2005, you need to know the ruling government in Syria, or the Ba'ath Party. They're a socialist party, and their grassroots, most of the supporters when they arrived into power were from the rural areas, were the peasants, were the working class. And this was preserved, this thing was preserved till 2005. In 2005, President Bashar al-Assad appointed Abdallah Dardawi as the vice prime minister of Syria, and he was in charge of changing the economic system, reforming the economic system in Syria into an open market system. And this has led into privatization of a lot of sectors in Syria, and private money has came into Syria, and the investment started. On one hand, it was very good for people who were able to integrate in this new economic system, but the vast majority of the people who were living in the rural areas, the peasants and the working people, were not able to do that. And by doing so, just imagine when you came to power in 1963, you came because you had the support of the peasants, you had the support of the working class, so the people were on the rural areas. But when the war started in Syria, most of the people who were against the government were from the rural areas, from these peasants, from these working people, because you hit their lifestyle, you hit their income, they weren't able to integrate and join this new economic system. So, for example, someone is living in Rif Damascus, on the rural area of Damascus, and is coming into the city, and he's like, am I living in Syria anymore? It's like there is a very huge gap between the city and the rural areas. This has really was a very important factor that led for a lot of people from the rural areas to join the armed rebellion against the government. Another lesson is secularization of Syria is very difficult, if not, it's almost impossible, in my opinion now. This is my new conviction in 2021. Look, when the father of Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad, tried to change the constitution in 1973 and to introduce a secular, fully secular constitution, and to abolish the article that says the president of Syria should be a Muslim. He received a great opposition from the religious institutions, from the Islamists in Syria, and he backed off. He didn't publish that constitution. And since 1973, especially after the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the petrodollar of Saudi Arabia, which radicalized also a lot of people, religion started to play a greater role in the region. It's no more like you have now Saudi Arabia, you have now Iran, and also Turkey after Erdogan. Like, you're surrounded by countries are becoming more religious, and you're trying to become more secular, and the influence, the impact of these changes that are happening in your neighborhood is so grave. It's not like you're not living on an island. So the Middle East has a lot of like intersection and interconnection among the people. So people started to become less secular due to these regional changes that happened in the last 3 or 4 decades. And now, after the war in Syria, now we are in 2021, in my opinion, and this is very unfortunate, Syria is becoming less secular every day. Even the government is becoming less secular, and the main reason for that is the government knows that there is a big bloc in Syria that is against the government, and they are against the government because they consider the government to be secular, and they want more conservative, more Islamic country. Syria is not going to be Islamic country, but it will be less secular country in order to appease these people and make them feel comfortable again in dealing with the Syrian government. So it's a tactical game maybe by the Syrian government, but I'm really not happy. I'm unhappy with this policy of the Syrian government of making peace with trying to make a peace with the Islamists through this policy, and instead of changing their mindset through a long process of educational indoctrination for them. If I'm a government, I would certainly do that. One of the lessons that we learned is sanctions sometimes kill more than weapons. Between 2011 till 2016, the war in Syria was mostly fought on military fronts. Now it is more economic warfare against Syria. And if you check the living standards of the people before 2016 and after 2016, it's a huge difference, especially with the currency change between currency rate between the Syrian lira and the dollar. I think it's around, it was like 50 Syrian pound per dollar before the war. It's now around 4,000. Can you imagine that? Oh, and still the Americans and Europeans are imposing more draconian sanctions on the Syrian people and telling lies after lies to their people that, we are targeting the Syrian regime, where the fact is they're targeting everyone who tries to import or export anything from Syria to into Syria or from Syria. How can you punish someone who is securing the milk or the wheat of Syria and then tell it it's a targeted sanctions? What do we need to do, in my opinion, in the next phase is also very important. First of all, we need to pursue and for economic integration with the regional powers. And I would like to start with Iraq, with Iran, with Lebanon, with Jordan, with the United Arab Emirates. Maybe when government changes in Erdogan leaves in the next elections, with Turkey. But economic integration is very important for the revival of the Syrian economy. But in order to do that, also, Americans and Europeans should lift the sanctions. Otherwise, these regional countries are not able to do any business with the Syrian government, knowing that if you are, let's say, a person or a businessman in the Emirates and you want to deal with Syria, United States is imposing sanctions even on you. So this is for my American followers, that we cannot really do anything about it. You need to do it. You need to exert pressure on your government. And I know it's also almost impossible to do that. I'm sure that you're losing your own rights now in the United States after Joe Biden came to power. We need less ideologies in Syria. I am for pan-Arabism if it means uniting, if it's a macro identity that unites all these divisions in Syria. But when we are talking about also pan-Arabism, the Baathists always talk about, we need to unite the entire Arab nations into one nation. That's not going to happen, period. We need to pursue our realistic goals, which is economic integration with the region, without uniting or trying to unite all the borders. Try to create an atmosphere of business and trade and educational exchanges between the Arab countries. Try to educate your people more. Try to improve their skills, create jobs, create businesses in your countries. This is the beginning of our reconstruction. But without that, expecting Russia to send you maybe 5 million or Iran to send you another 5 million, it's no-brainer. It's no-brainer to, I mean, you cannot really rebuild your country with this kind of loans or grants from these countries. You need actual manufacturing and business relationship with the neighborhood. Syria needs to think more about itself than thinking about other people. Like, I am for, like, full-heartedly with the Iraqi people when they arrived into Syria in 2003 after the occupation. Around 2 million refugees, the Palestinian refugees, the Lebanese, they are all in our hearts, and we treated them as Syrian citizens. However, it is also now time for Syria to say, Syria first. We should rebuild our country, we should restore our economic strength, our political strength, our military strength, and when we have enough power to help other people, we should and must help other people, but not on the expense of the Syrian people who are living in a very dire situation now in Syria. And I can guarantee you that the situation in Syria right now is horrible. It is deadly. People are committing suicide, and I'm reading this news on a daily basis. So if you have any relatives in Syria or friends or anyone you know in Syria and you're able to transfer even 50 euros per month, that makes a huge difference in Syria. Help your friends in Syria, help your family, be caring, and I hope one day when we rebuild our country and you come to visit Syria, we will treat you like a king and like a queen in our country, like we always do with our foreign tourists and friends. So this was all. I hope you like my summary, and if you do, please hit the subscribe button and the like. And if you want to support my independent journalism work, I invite you to become a patron. All the links in the description below. It's very important for me to stay independent and bring my honest opinion without any affiliation to anyone. I'm Kevork Almassian of Syriana Analysis, and see you next time.